This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK. This is the BBC.
Hello, this is the Word of Mouth podcast, and I'm Michael Rosen. On Word of Mouth, we talk about words and language and the weird and wonderful ways we're using them right now. Some years ago, there was a profile of Rabbi Lionel Blue, no longer with us. It was on TV. I seem to remember that part of it was a kind of day in the life sequence, and he visited an old and dear friend of his who was being cared for. This was Sydney Carter, songwriter and singer who I'd often seen in folk clubs and concerts in the 1960s. His most famous song, you probably know it, is Lord of the Dance. Well, when Rabbi Blue went to see him, Sydney Carter had dementia. Blue explained that he couldn't have the same old lovely conversations that he used to have with his friend, but they could enjoy music together. And then we saw on the film Rabbi Lionel Blue and Sydney Carter, who had given the world this lovely song, and they stomped round the room together singing, "I am the Lord of the Dance," said he. And well, they were dancing together. And it's a moment that's never left me. And today we're talking about dementia with linguist Alison Ray, a professor of language and communication at Cardiff University. And Alison has been researching the ins and outs of communicating with people with dementia for a book she's working on called The Dynamics of Dementia Communication. So Alison, let's do basics first. What is dementia?
Well, dementia is an umbrella term for the symptoms that are caused by a range of brain diseases that affect our cognitive abilities. So our ability to think, to understand, to remember, to plan. And different diseases cause different symptoms, so different types of dementia. So just to give a couple of examples, we're very familiar with Alzheimer's disease, and one of the difficulties associated with that is losing the ability to lay down new memories. There are other symptoms too. And that's because the damage starts in the hippocampus area of the brain, which is the area that lays down new memories. But there are other kinds of dementia, such as dementia with Lewy bodies, where people might have hallucinations and difficulties processing visual information.
Is that somebody's name when you said...
Yes, that was the scientist, I think, who identified it. Yes,
right,
Lewy.
yeah.
And then there's vascular dementia, which is the second most common form of dementia, which is caused by little mini strokes very often. And then people may have problems with planning and decision making. And there are one or two types of dementia which specifically have linguistic symptoms. One of them is progressive non-fluent aphasia, where people can have difficulty producing the speech sounds that put the words together. So they have actual difficulty producing the words themselves. And then there's semantic dementia, which linguists are particularly interested in, because there the words form and the words meaning get dissociated. They split apart. And
the
so
words
the person,
that people are saying don't mean the things that person is intending.
Well, that could be the case, but it's also if they hear a word, they won't necessarily know what it means. So there was an example I read recently of a woman who was asked, have you ever been to America? And she said, America, I wish I knew what that was.
Oh, right. But she had once known, obviously.
Which she would have once known, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Any more examples under your umbrella, or is that it?
Well, what I can say is that although language isn't always directly affected by dementia, there are indirect effects on the communication. So, for example, if you have Alzheimer's and you have difficulty recalling what happened a short while ago, inevitably that's going to affect what you talk about. You might repeat yourself. You might ask a question that you had already had an answer to because you don't recall that you've already had it. And so it'll affect what you're saying to other people and therefore how they respond back to you. If you have a kind of dementia where you don't recognise the person you're talking to, that's going to make it very hard to say the most appropriate things, and they may notice that.
Yes, I'm thinking quite a famous example. I think I can say who it was. It was Harold Wilson, and he resigned very suddenly, and there were all sorts of kind of paranoid and conspiratorial reasons as to why he'd done it, but I think it all came down to the fact that he had a form of dementia. And one of the ways this was first spotted was that he went into a social occasion. And he said, I've been to Russia 23 times. And then people carried on talking. And then he said, I've been to Russia 23 times. Then he carried on talking. He said, I've been to Russia 23 times. Now, that would indicate to me that he sort of knew that he was in a kind of diplomatic area. He remembered that he was Prime Minister. He knew that they knew he was Prime Minister. But what he didn't know was that he was saying the same thing over and over again.
Yes, and of course what happens then is that people around him immediately notice something strange, and it puts them into a very awkward position. Should they mention to him that he said it before, or did he mention it again for a reason? We often do repeat things that we've just said, but we do it for a reason.
Yes, my wife tells me that I do all the time, yes. Yes.
But we will sometimes do it because we want to emphasise a point, or because we feel we didn't get the response we wanted last time.
We didn't get heard, as
we didn't
say.
get heard, that's right.
Yes. Now look, shoot me down on this. One image that I have of dementia is that it's as if our brains are a bit like a kind of mixed farm. And there's lots of different things going on in different parts of the farm. So we've got cows over there, and then we've got chickens over here, and then there's some wheat growing over there. So I'm getting very different things going on, you see. And then somebody's mending a tractor, so that's, again, very, very different. They're all varied, but they're all linked, you see. That's my image. We've got the farmer in the middle, and then along comes dementia, and maybe some of the activities just closed down. That field that was growing wheat's not being used anymore. It's lying fallow, and then the chickens have gone, that sort of thing. Now, am I anywhere near it, or is that misleading?
It's a great metaphor. I think it reflects, I suppose, how we used to think about the brain. We used to have much more of a sense that it was divided up into parts that did different things. It's still the case that if you have damage in a particular part of the brain, it will affect a particular kind of function. But these days we think of the brain as being much more joined up, much more networked. A colleague of mine in the States, who's a neuroscientist, said we get the measure of how the brain works, and then we get a new piece of kit, and we realise that everything we thought we knew before is completely wrong. And then we go along with that for a bit, and we get another new piece of kit that can measure even in more fine detail how the brain works, and we realise that everything we thought we knew then was wrong.
Right, so we'll chuck out the farm. The farm's gone. Get rid of that. Exactly. What have we got instead?
That's a metaphor, I think, from my point of view, is like a big road network. So there are lots of places you can go to, and there's roads to get you there, and there's side roads that will get you there by a slightly different route. So you may have your preferred route for getting from A to B, but if there was a block in that road and you couldn't go that route, then probably you would be able to find an alternative route to get round the back to where you wanted to get to. There are some quite useful ideas around a concept called reserve. So brain reserve is how big your network is and how wide your roads are and how reliable those roads are. So if you had a little block, can you just squeeze past it? Or do you have another route that will take you there? That's something called brain reserve, and that's the way your brain is actually set up and wired in the first place. And if you have...
So we've got a sort of... Can I call that a reservoir of knowledge, or it's not quite that, is it? You're saying
it's more the infrastructure. It's more the infrastructure, the actual the way the brain itself is organised.
Yes.
So that may be to do with your very early learning, how all the connections were made and how resilient they are. And if you have high brain reserve, you can actually resist the damage for quite a lot longer because you can always find an alternative route. And then there's cognitive reserve, which is, I suppose, really how you have across your life used those routes. So are you used to taking alternate routes to things? Is it something that's quite normal for you to think of another way around things? So if you're used to thinking metaphorically, for example, you're used to thinking of an idea and then finding a different way to express it.
So that's a certain amount of flexibility there.
Absolutely.
Because we have those words, possibly still metaphorical, but we talk about people being rigid in their thinking or that they're fixed or even fixated to something. And then you can let that go if you're not and think, oh, well, I'll turn that right. I would say on its head. We'll turn it on its head. We'll invert it.
Exactly.
So some people do a lot of that. Some people don't do very much of it.
So some people are more imaginative and more adventurous, I suppose. And the more cognitive reserve you have, again, the more likely you are to be able to manage with the symptoms of dementia without them stopping you doing what you want to do.
Well, let's have an example now. We had an email from a listener to Word of Mouth who said, I'm interested in the invention used by the human brain when it can't find the normal terms or words to describe something. My mother has come up with two. While trying to say petrol station, she came up with the place cars go when they're thirsty. That's what she said. The second was when I'd just shown her a photo of her father and she said, when did I become a puppy? Now, I thought for a moment, says the listener, and then said, Mum, do you mean when you were born? And then cracked up laughing as she said, yes, that's it. So does that actually illustrate what you were saying?
Yes, I think it does. It's a very nice example of what we call circumlocution, finding a different way to express an idea when you can't find the word you want. So it's as if she's come up against a roadblock on her route to finding the word baby or the word garage, and she's just gone in a different way round and found another way of expressing it. And it's been very successful because he's understood in each case what she meant. And what's lovely about it is they laughed about it. So they got a bit of humour out of it, which is always a good idea if you can. It's a good idea to be able to laugh about these things and enjoy and find them interesting rather than being depressed about the fact that you couldn't find the word.
So thinking about the brain, this great big chunk of grey stuff that I've seen in laboratories and so on, and actually, anyway, I used to do medicine, so I've seen these sorts of things. All right. So we now can think of this as all those millions of little connections that quite literally, materially, physically, instead of going through route A, I can go through route B, C and D, and it's in another part. Is it physical?
Yes,
like
it is
what
physical,
we think
I think. Yeah, it is physical. And the brain is actually quite good at finding new routes. I think the research now suggests that even into old age, one can actually learn new routes for doing things. Whereas before we used to think that, well, you know, if you hadn't learned how to do something when you were a child, that was all set and probably could never be changed. But I think we find the brain is much more flexible than we thought it was.
So this listener's mum, who's saying the place cars go when they're thirsty, so she's got the whole sense of the car drinking the petrol and the place that you go in order to get the stuff to stop stop the car being thirsty. Do you know what I'm thinking of now is that I can speak French and it's okay, but there are concepts, or maybe it's the word, maybe it's the concept that I struggle with, and then I really make an effort to find a way round it. You know, I might not quite remember the word for mowing a lawn, so apart from mad gestures, I might start saying cut the lawn, and it may not be exactly the right word to use. So is it anything like that?
It is very similar. It's circumlocution. It's finding another way around when you haven't got the word that you want. So superficially, it looks very similar. But actually, there are some very important differences between what a foreign language learner is doing and what a person with dementia is doing. And we can think about that in terms of if you were to go out to the garden centre and buy a plant in a pot and then put it into the garden, it's got some roots, but they haven't yet gone down very far into the soil. They haven't picked up the nutrients from the soil in the garden, and they haven't tangled together with all of the other roots all around. So although that plant is sitting on the surface, it's really not very resilient.
So all I've got is the word, and it hasn't made connections with all the other words around it that I need for it to be fully remembered and have meaning.
Precisely. Yeah? Word knowledge takes a very, very long time to develop. Learning the form of the word and some straightforward meaning, as you might do in a foreign language, is just the first part. But it's using the word and seeing it in context, seeing what it does, which other words it hangs around with, what effect those other words have on its meaning. That takes a very, very long time to develop. And of course, people with dementia who perhaps can't think of the form of the word that they want, they still have all of that deep knowledge underneath. And we see that with the lady who can't think of the word baby, but she's got the word puppy has got so many of the same features as baby. She knows that those two words are linked together, and
but
so
they're
she
linked
can
together
use that
semantically. They're not linked together in this particular case either by sound or not even necessarily by grammar, because it might be when I was born, which is not the same grammar as when I was a puppy, exactly, is it? So,
exactly right.
So it's the semantic field.
It's at the semantic level, yeah. She's found some block that stopped her getting from the thought of baby to the form of baby, but she's found other meanings, and then she's gone round the back to those meanings so she can find the words for those instead.
So what we've got instead then is we've got all the roots in place, going back to your garden centre, right? So we've got all the roots in place, but maybe the little plant at the top has gone.
Well, it may not have gone. I mean, very often these words do come back. I mean, you've just lost it at the precise moment that you wanted it. We all have that problem.
Oh, that's me when I'm trying to remember the names of footballers.
There we are, yes.
My son looks at me just amazed that I've just forgotten the name of some famous footballer who was playing half an hour earlier, and I've forgotten his name.
Yeah. But then it'll come back later. And very often, as we know from the tip of the tongue phenomenon, you can know all sorts of things about that name, You can know how many syllables it's got, where the stress is, what the first letter is, that it's a French name, all sorts of things you might know, just not be able to quite put your finger on it, but it'll come back later.
I think you know me. Yes. So are there patterns to how language can go wrong? I know we've talked about some, and these reflect how it's actually being managed in the brain.
Yes, there are. Let's give an example of, suppose I said to you, I'd love another cup of coffee. Then at one level, that's quite straightforward. I'm asking for another cup of coffee, but the intonation I've used, the stress I've used, give a great deal more information about exactly the message that I'm giving to you personally at a particular point in time.
You could be a bit peevish because I hadn't brought you the coffee
Exactly.
and you rather hoped that I might have.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So if we break that down, we could say, well, in order to say that, I have to produce some speech sounds. So I've got to line up all of the consonants and vowels in the right order and bring them out fluently. And I've got to put the intonation on and so on. And I've got to have enough breath control to be able to get enough sounds to come out. Now, some people with dementia can have difficulties in that process. So they find it hard to sequence the sounds in the right order or to get enough breath so they sound very quiet. So that's one of the things that can go wrong in a person's language.
So when you say the sequence, you mean they might get the words around the wrong order, or they might get the letters...
They might get the sounds, they might
yes.
muddle up the D and the P in different places,
Gotcha.
and so on. And then the next thing that you have to do if you're producing a sentence like that is you need to choose the words and the grammatical patterns. And we know that what often happens with people with dementia is they have word-finding difficulties. So they mean to produce something fluent, but they get stuck on a word. They have to find another way. We were talking about circumlocution. They have to find another way. They might have pauses. They might be very slow. You might have to be quite patient waiting for them to finish saying what they want, and you have to decide whether to help them out by thinking of the word for them and so on.
You had a grammar there of a question, which means an inversion. You had to say, can I, rather than I can.
Yes,
so
that's right. Though, in fact, interestingly, what I said, I'd love another cup of coffee.
Didn't you? You didn't ask the question.
It is a question, or it's a request, but I haven't formulated it as one. And the point is that that's a choice that I've made. And the way we do that is the third stage. So I have to start off with the image that I would like a cup of coffee to be here. I can't get it for myself, so I've got to figure out how am I going to persuade you to provide me the thing that I want. And then the decisions I make about how I frame that are determined by who am I talking to, where are we, have you already said to me, is there anything you would like, in which case that would be a perfect reply, or did you in fact ask me a quarter of an hour ago and now you've got your hands full with 6 other jobs and asking you that right now is going to be a real imposition. All of these things I have to take into account to decide how polite do I need to be? Should I frame it as a request or as a statement as I did? And so on and so on. Now, a person with dementia who is having difficulties recalling what happened recently, what was said 10 minutes ago, might not be sure whether they've just had a cup of coffee, whether they've just been offered one and said no, may not be sure who the person is they're talking to or what their role is. Are they a waiter, in which case it's entirely appropriate to ask for a cup of coffee, or are they somebody else, so it's a bit of an imposition? All of these things can make a difference. So they might ask for a cup of coffee and it would come across sounding wrong to the other person in the context. It might sound a bit brusque.
So what you're saying is any one or some of these different things that you've just been talking about could have gone wrong, if we can use gone wrong, if that's
exactly.
all right to say that.
Yes.
But that could have not be working right.
Any one of these things, and other things too, can upset the way that the communication happens. And the other person is then put in a position where they're trying to figure out, did you really mean to say that way? What were you trying to get at? And they're having to sort of second guess and fill in the gaps that perhaps have been left because the person couldn't express quite what they wanted, which is very hard work.
Yeah, so how would you advise family members and friends to help a person with dementia to, well, we're talking about expression, aren't we? It's to express themselves as well as possible. There'll be people listening who've got close friends, relatives. What do we say? What do we say to them, to the helpers, the carers, the relations, so that they can help the person with one of these forms of dementia?
I think the biggest risk is that we are all very, very sensitive to communication not working well. And so when somebody says something that we weren't expecting or in a way we weren't expecting, it doesn't take long before we get quite anxious and perhaps a bit annoyed, frustrated, and of course then you get a downward spiral very quickly in the relationship. And so the key thing is to recognise that these things happen because of the disease, not because of the person. And so you need to be able to stand back and say, okay, is there a way that I can manage this? Can I observe the kind of patterns that are going on and work out some useful ways of approaching this that are not going to upset the other person who's trying to communicate and perhaps it isn't going quite well? It's tough for them. Is there a way to help them? So
we're back in a way with pathways.
Well, in a way.
In other words,
yes.
the listener in this case, or
Indeed,
the carer, they need other pathways, because if they just go piling straight in there,
Exactly.
assuming that it's as it was 10 years earlier, then
Yes.
it won't work. So you've got to find new pathways.
And indeed, it's trying to think, what is the person likely to have meant to say? Can I work out what's likely? As the listener did there with his mother when, she says puppy. Well, what do you mean when was I a puppy? It kind of doesn't make any sense. But you meant something, so what is it likely to have been? And
so the
was it
listener
put two and two
supplied the
together?
word. The listener
Exactly.
then said,
Yeah.
When were you born? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
And is that okay then to
It is.
dive in there?
Some people with dementia will be very grateful that you do that. Others will wish that you would just give them a chance to say it for themselves. And they might vary from day to day, as any of us might. Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of being sensitive to that, seeing what the person probably would like you to do, rather than just piling in every time and making it just your response. You always do it that way. I have to say, you can speak slowly to people, obviously, and just be patient with them. The bottom line, actually, for engaging with a person with dementia, and probably with everybody we ever deal with in the entire world, is be kind. Just remember to be kind to each other, because it's very easy when communication doesn't work to get defensive and perhaps a bit aggressive, and we don't mean to, and we feel terrible about it afterwards. But just remembering that if you walk into any situation with kindness, then that will go a really long way to make things work better.
Now, I've seen both on television and know of somebody that the person with dementia, because they were, how can I put it? You can correct me if I'm putting this wrong, misinterpreted who they thought they were talking to. That then the person with dementia became quite violent because
yes.
they thought there was either theft going on, or someone was trying to play a trick on them, or that they were being racist towards them. And so then that becomes quite tricky for the carers, because at one level they're just trying to defend themselves,
Yes.
right, physically, mentally, or whatever.
Yes. Yes.
So it's not even a matter of finding a route, is it? It's that point really of the most extreme tension between them.
It is, and there the skill of really good carers is finding a way to step sideways from that, so that you can get yourself out of any situation that might feel at all perilous, but then come to understand that the person with dementia is doing that for a reason. Perhaps they feel very insecure, they're not sure where they are, they feel as though they're surrounded by strangers, and they need reassurance.
So can you say, hello, I'm not your mother, or I'm not your father, I'm Dave, look, I'm Dave. But that's no good, is it? Because that bit of this connection between that person and Dave has gone.
Well, it might work. It often can work. If the person has mistaken you for somebody else, you can say, well, no, I'm not that person, but I'm this other person, and this is how I fit in. That can sometimes work,
right.
Yes.
Right,
yes.
Yeah. And do you think... Well, what do you think? Is it okay to tell lies to someone with dementia? I think this is something that bothers people, because you might be protecting them from information they can't handle, like maybe that their husband has died.
Yes.
Let's say.
This is a really, really tricky area. There was a big report published about a year, 18 months ago on precisely this question about telling lies to people with dementia. On the one hand, people with dementia are very vulnerable, and they're very easy to lie to. I mean, they're not in a strong position to assess whether something is truthful or not, and that means to say we really shouldn't be taking advantage of them. But on the other hand, they could be in a situation where they believe something that is going to be dangerous to them. Let's take the example of somebody who believes that they can still drive their car, and so they're looking for the car keys and want to go out and drive, and the family member or the carer knows that they're not fit to drive, and so they say to them, well, I'm sorry, we've lost the car keys. Or the car's out there,
down.
or the car's broken down, that kind of thing. And is that okay or not? And that's a very tricky one. And there's, as you say, the bereavement one. If the person with dementia believes that their mother is waiting for them at home, and they're in their 80s, and they believe their mother's waiting for them at home to come home from school. If you say to them truthfully, well, I'm sorry, but your mother died, 40 years ago. Well, if they don't know that anymore, then you're just putting them through a tremendous sense of pain and bereavement, and they'll be in the shock of all of that. And then maybe an hour later, they don't remember what it is that's upset them, but they still feel terrible. And then because they feel upset, they're saying, well, I want to go and find my mother. And then you tell them again, and they go through it all again. That's clearly not a great thing for them. And so what tends to happen is that as people become more experienced with working with people with dementia and have been through this a few times, they will say, well, no, we need to find other ways of dealing with this. You don't actually have to say, oh, yes, your mother's definitely waiting for you at home, we'll go later or something. But you could say something like, I don't think you need to worry about your mum right now. Why don't we come and do this other kind of thing? And let's go out into the garden and walk around, or tell me about your mum. And try and get to the bottom of why it is that they would want to go to their mum. They're feeling insecure. They're feeling that they don't know where they are. We all want to run to our mum in that sense in our heads, And so trying to get to the root of the emotion that is driving them to be talking about them.
Right. So in a way, you're saying go behind the immediate sort of linguistic feature, which is I'm going home to mum, and deal with this whole emotional field that was why the person said it.
Exactly.
And then we may never have to actually
Yes.
confront the person with this stark fact in language, your mum is dead. So we're not going to say that.
Yes, you don't have to say
so
that.
We're going to go around.
Yeah, you can go around that. And there was a study done quite recently where some people who had a diagnosis of dementia were asked, they were given different scenarios like the car keys one and the bereavement one and so on. And they said, well, what do you think we should do in these situations? And these people with dementia said, well, we don't like the idea of being lied to, but we can see why you might need to do that. So yes, I suppose it probably can be acceptable to lie to a person with dementia if that's the situation that you're faced with. And I thought that was quite interesting to actually go and ask people with a dementia diagnosis how they felt about it, because so many of these decisions are made by other people rather than by them.
And then let's just flip that. If someone with dementia is saying something that's clearly untrue, all right, so it's said that some people with dementia, they might think that people are stealing from them, that things aren't where they think they are, so things being stolen. Is it helpful to challenge them and go, no, nobody's stealing from you, don't worry about it? Or what?
Well, probably in most cases that's the first thing one would try and do. But again, you've got to look beneath the surface. Why would the person think they're being stolen from? Probably because they looked for something and it wasn't where they thought it was. Perhaps it's been tidied up by somebody else. Perhaps they tidied it up or moved it, but don't recall that they did so.
Because they haven't got the explanatory framework anymore.
Exactly, and they can't recall
that's the pathway they've lost.
Yeah. And so then what you might be saying is, well, I wonder if it's just got mislaid. Shall we go and look for it? So that's another way round. So it just pulls them away, but tries to solve the underlying problem that they are trying to solve by saying somebody's stolen it. Saying somebody's stolen it is a great explanation for why you can't find it.
Yes, I think quite a lot of us do that. Yeah, and why do people with some types of dementia talk about the past so much? Because that is a common thing that I've heard, is that it's almost they go back to the first 10 years maybe, or maybe up to 20, but then there's a whole other area of their life that they don't seem to be interested in.
Yes, well, I don't know what the research says on this, but one thing that strikes me is that if you have a difficulty with recalling recent events, so what you did yesterday, whether somebody visited you yesterday, what you had for breakfast, then every time you try to talk about recent events, people are going to be correcting you. They're going to be saying, no, come on, we did this yesterday, don't you remember? And it doesn't take long before you would start to feel very insecure and out of sorts, vulnerable. Every time I talk about things in the recent past, I get told I'm wrong. Or I realise that I don't recall them, and then I feel terrible because I don't know what's going on. Well, what would you do? If you go back and talk about things from longer ago, those memories are still intact because they've been laid down a long time ago and that part of the brain hasn't been affected. So you can recall those things, but also you can talk about those as an expert. You can tell people stories about your childhood and they weren't there, so they can't challenge them. If you say there were 6 lovely apple trees in my garden when I was a child, nobody's going to say, no, there weren't, because you were there and they weren't. And so it gives a person a lot more sense of authority. They can tell these stories and be themselves, be the person that they recall being before they had this disease.
And I've sometimes picked up a certain anxiety that the listeners, the carers, won't know how important this is. I can remember having a conversation with an old person, and every time I met him, he told the same story, and it was an awful story from the Second World War, to do with people in a boat and underneath the water, and it was just an awful thing. And every time I met him, he told me the same story. I'm not sure whether he was suffering from any dementia, but it was that idea that you return to a thing that is important, and somehow or other you're worried that younger people around you won't know it. So there's even an anxiety about returning to the thing in the past.
There can be, and I think you're absolutely right that some people say that when you get dementia, it starts to, in a sense, uncover some of the things that you've been able to cover up and suppress during your life. You lose some of that ability to kind of gloss over things, and you get a sort of a more truthful entry into earlier parts of your life. And if that event was really, really important to you, you want to work through it in a way.
Now, we've talked about the brain rather as a sort of chunk, and with these pathways, and we had the roads and motorways metaphor. But what if we think about it in terms of social causes? Do you talk about social causes of these linguistic problems? Is that another way of talking about it?
It is. I mentioned earlier on that people's level of symptoms can vary, and how soon the brain disease takes effect and starts change their lives can depend on their brain reserve and their cognitive reserve. But there's 2 other kinds of reserve that I've been developing in my work. One of them is emotional reserve, and that's essentially the personal resilience that people have to experiencing having dementia, and also of being a family member or a carer of a person with dementia. How well can you take the knocks that go with that, the indignities and the awkwardnesses and so on? How well can you stand back from them?
So this is from your pre-dementia life, probably, how well you coped with emotional upheavals anyway.
I think so, yes, I think so. And if you have high emotional reserve, then you'll be able to cope, you'll be able to stand back from them, laugh about them a little bit more, and just be a little bit more resilient. And then the other one is social reserve. And there are 3 elements to social reserve. One is the infrastructure. So the social infrastructure we have, so you go to a memory clinic and you get a diagnosis of early stage dementia. Well, what happens then? Now, in a really good environment, social environment, you would find that all sorts of things slot into place. You get a letter from so-and-so saying, well, you're entitled to this extra financial benefit to help with care. And somebody calls you and says, now we've got this diagnosis, you can do this, and there's a club you can join here, and here's some other kinds of support. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen, and rather family members end up sort of rushing around trying to find out where they can get information, telling people things, trying to work out what do we do now that this person has this dementia diagnosis. And so there's a lot that can be done by the social infrastructure to provide that extra level of support so that the person can cope with what they're going through without having all these extra nightmares and things to deal with as well. Then there's the personal level, there's the social support at the personal level. Have you got family and friends around you? Have you got friends who will pop in and help you out, neighbours who will pop in and help you out? Have you got groups that you can go to? How friendly is your community? If you're in the supermarket and you're struggling to work out how much money to get out your purse? Are people behind you stumping and huffing and making a noise, or are they trying to help you? Are they understanding of you? And this links into the third kind of social support that we can have, which is the way that our ambient society's attitudes, particularly through the media, influence the way we see dementia. Do we see dementia as something that is frightening and we want to keep away from? So if we hear our neighbour has dementia, are we going to kind of cross the road to keep away from them because we're worried about, what they might say or how we might react? Or is there a way to develop a more positive attitude so that we sort of find the opportunities to engage with people and enable them to be the best they can be? We know that two of the major risk factors for dementia and two symptoms that go along with dementia very often are loneliness and depression. And that's largely to do with the fact that people don't have enough of this social reserve. They don't have enough. Do we
think that social reserve, that attitude in society is changing? Do we think that there is enough information out there so that people don't feel that dementia is a shameful thing, or that it's, worse than shameful, somehow bad, or it's a failing? It's just part of now our human condition, or probably always has been, and so we've got to find these social ways of coping with it. I mean, in other words, it's the language about dementia as well as dementia itself.
I think things are changing. There's been a big initiative. There's been initiatives worldwide to try and bring dementia research and awareness of dementia up the agenda. There's been to try and give it the same amount of support and attention that we've had for cancer, for example, and to take it away from being that kind of horrible, frightening thing that nobody wants to talk about it, and bring it out into the open so that we can recognise the many fantastic things that people with dementia can still do. I have a nice example of this. A few years ago, I published a paper about a retired singing teacher who was running a weekend course for singers who just came along to sing to her, to sing to the group, and she would give them feedback on how well they'd sung and how to improve their performance. And she had quite noticeable symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. Very unusual to find somebody with that level of Alzheimer's disease still working. But there she was. And because she was in a position of authority and she was doing something that she knew very well how to do, everybody was working with her to get the meaning out that she wanted to express. So she would say things like, yes, darling, you're doing that a little bit too much like that, which doesn't have a lot of content to it. But then the singers would be saying, oh, do you mean I was doing this? Yes. And she sustained this whole weekend of teaching these singers, and they came away and they had learnt lots more about how to sing because she still knew what she wanted them to do. She was just having difficulty expressing herself. And she did it with extraordinary dignity and focus, despite the fact that she was having to deal with all these extra problems. And it was a real lesson to me about just how much capacity people with dementia often have as experts in their field, if only you will give them a chance to express those things. To express
it, yes. Now, there has been some research suggesting that dementia could be identified early by screening people's language. Is that true?
It's hard to say whether it's true at the moment. There's a lot of interest in this, and the reason is that at the moment, to diagnose dementia, you have to put people through tests and scans, maybe take blood tests and so on. It's a bit intrusive, whereas language is all around you. If you could sit somebody down for half an hour, a quarter of an hour, and listen to their language and identify whether or not they have the early stages of dementia, that would be fantastic. I don't think we've got there yet, but there are some very interesting things that have been found out. One of the things that's caught my interest is a phenomenon called idea density, and that's how many words does it take you to express your ideas. If I give you an example of a sentence, if I say, the fierce Rottweiler circled the bedraggled undergraduate. Now, in those 7 words, I've got an awful lot of meaning into there. That's very, very dense, the ideas caught in there, in comparison to saying there was a dog, a Rottweiler, really fierce, and it walked around this student who was really wet. Well, it has the same meaning, but that was 18 words for the same amount of meaning. And that's a lower idea density. So one of the studies that was done was looking at whether idea density changes when people develop Alzheimer's disease. And the study I'm thinking about was started off looking at the novels of Iris Murdoch, who, of course, had Alzheimer's towards the end of her life. And they took her last book, which she wrote while she had these symptoms, and they compared it to a book from the middle of her career and the early part of her career. And when they looked at the idea density, they found that the last novel was had a lower idea density. It took her more words to express her ideas. So they said, well, that's interesting, but we don't know that that's to do with the Alzheimer's. It could be natural variation. It could be to do with getting older, who knows?
Or deliberate stylistic experimentation, I suppose.
So what they then did was they went to the works of P.D. James, who was a similar age and had written all the way through her life as well, but didn't have Alzheimer's. And they did the same thing with a late book, a middle book, and an early career book. And they found no difference in the idea density. So they said, well, that's interesting. So maybe that shows that the idea density is to do with the Alzheimer's. So they then say, well, people have always wondered whether Agatha Christie had Alzheimer's. There was a suggestion that she might have done. So let's take her books and compare them.
Yes.
And so they did the same thing with Agatha Christie, and they found the same pattern in Agatha Christie as they found in Iris Murdoch, that the idea density was lower in her last book. And they say, well, we don't know for sure, but that does suggest that maybe she did have Alzheimer's at the end of her career. And then the other thing that's been done with idea density, which is rather more spooky, actually, rather strange, is that your idea density level in your early adulthood might predict whether or not you'll get Alzheimer's in old age.
Oh, that is spooky.
So there was a study done in the 1990s and the early 2000s in America called the Nun Study, and it was done with an order of nuns, about 600 odd nuns, who had agreed to be part of an ageing study, and some of them had agreed for their brain to be examined after their death as well. And some of these nuns had got Alzheimer's, and some of similar age hadn't got Alzheimer's. And this particular order of nuns, when the women had joined, usually in their late teens and early 20s, they had written a little autobiographical essay which said, their family and why they wanted to join the convent and so on. The linguists went back to these essays and analysed them, and they found that the idea density was lower in these early essays, average age 22, in the women who ended up with Alzheimer's in old age. Now, that was very strange finding, and it stood on its own for a long time, because it's really hard to get that kind of data. You've got to have the older people who've got to be comparable,
yes.
And nuns are wonderfully comparable.
And it's got to be longitudinal,
and it's got to be long. You've got to have the text from early on. But then, in 2010, another study was done on medical students from the 1940s to 60s who had signed up for a lifelong medical study. They were in old age as well. Some of them had got Alzheimer's and some hadn't. And they went back to the essays that they wrote at the average age of 22 when they were getting into medical school, analysed them and found the same thing.
So we're beginning to think that there really is a pattern around this idea of
well, there may be,
density.
but just what it is hard to say. I suspect there's something more that we haven't got to grips with. I work in a university. I'm surrounded by young people of average age 22. I would be really worried about the idea that we might pick up their essays and look at the idea density and then say, you, and you're going to get Alzheimer's. I don't think we can do that at the moment. But there's something going on there, and it needs a lot more research.
Is it true that being bilingual, there's another one of these theories that I've seen popping up, I'm firing these at you as if somehow we're going to get some definite answers. Is it true that being bilingual protects you from getting Alzheimer's? That's another one I've heard.
Being bilingual isn't going to protect you from the brain disease, because that is going to be independent. That is caused by other things. What it might do, though, is it might alter how long it takes before the symptoms start to show. And that could be to do with the thing we were talking about earlier on, how agile you are at finding ways of thinking your way around expressing yourself. Because if you're using one or more than one language, you're doing it all the time. You're suppressing one language and using the other one, and so on. And what they had found was that if you went into bilingual communities, or communities where some people are bilingual and some are monolingual. Wales is one of them where it's been done. And then you went to the memory clinics and you just found the people who were bilingual and the people who were monolingual and just found their average age. They found that the people who were bilingual tended to be about 4.5 years older when they got referred to memory clinic. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they got the brain disease any later, at a later age, but it could mean that they were able to stave off the symptoms showing for longer.
Yes, yeah. So is there any point at all in doing any kind of exercises, brain training? You know, some people say, do crosswords. Do cryptic crosswords. That's the key thing, because cryptic crosswords involve all sorts of rather strange tangential thought, don't they, and lateral ideas. And that way, you won't get dementia if you do.
Well, I'm kind of hoping
crosswords.
that that's true, because I'm a great cryptic crossword fan. So I like to think that it is actually a good way. I don't know. What I do know, though, is that there are a range of things that we can do to minimise our risk of getting the disease and of getting the symptoms showing with the disease. And the latest thinking on this is that it's very closely related to the way we look after our heart. So heart disease
not very
and
linguistic at
brain
all.
disease are very similar. So it's the Mediterranean diet, it's getting your exercise, it's keeping your weight under control, not smoking, not drinking too much alcohol. All the things that we would be wanting to do anyway for our general health seem to be also the things that will maximise our chances of not getting these dementia-causing diseases.
And can I ask you a personal question? How did you come to be interested in this?
Well, my interest in linguistics goes back to when I was at school, and I was doing Russian classes at school, which I was lucky to be able to do. And our Russian teacher was doing a master's in linguistics at the time, and she used to come in with these great stories. One of them I remember was we learnt the Russian word for bear, the animal, which is medved, which, when you translate it literally, is honey eater. And she said, well, the reason for that is that in prehistoric times, when they used to go out hunting, they didn't want to mention the bear's real name because it was a bad spirit, and if it heard its name, it would come and attack them. And so they came up with this euphemism to talk about the bear. And that just caught my imagination. I've no idea if it's true or not, but it was a lovely story, and it just caught my imagination, and I started reading about history of language and so on, and then discovered that you could study linguistics at university, which was, I was just a pig in clover then. It was absolutely wonderful. And then I did a PhD on the ways that the brain processes language, which areas of the brain process language. And that got me interested in phrases, how we process phrases, particularly phrases that really behave like they're a single word. Breaking them down doesn't do you any good. A good example is by and large. It's written as 3 words, but really it ought to be written as one big one, because breaking it down doesn't give you any sense of its meaning at all. And it's a very interesting phenomenon, what we call formulaic language. And it's a huge phenomenon. Actually, it goes to many more kinds of phrases that are very transparent, like see you later. Well, that's a kind of idiomatic phrase. It's totally transparent. You can break it down. But it seems to have a special status in the brain. And I wrote a book about that in 2002, and afterwards somebody from the States contacted me and she said, I've been reading your book and it's really relevant to my work on Alzheimer's disease, because people with Alzheimer's disease use a lot of formulaic language. Oh, well, I didn't know about that. So I went and read it and started looking at conversations between people with Alzheimer's disease and their carers and family members. And what I found was really strange was I wasn't surprised that people with Alzheimer's disease used a lot of formulaic language, because it's easy to process. You pull out one word and you've got a whole sentence all at once. So it reduces your processing. But why were the carers using so much formulaic language? That seemed really strange to me. And it meant that I had to stand back and say, you can't just look at this as a cognitive phenomenon, as something to do with the way the brain works. You have to look at the interaction, how people relate to each other, what people expect each other to say, and what goes wrong when one person doesn't say what's expected. How does that make the other person feel? How do they behave? How will they respond? Because that will determine how they then speak themselves.
Well, Alison Ray, thank you very much indeed. Thanks so much for listening to the Word of Mouth podcast. I hope you enjoyed the programme. If you did, please subscribe and recommend us to your friends, and give us a review or rating on your podcast provider. It all helps spread the word. Thanks again for listening.